The room didn't explode. No sirens at first. No frantic shouting. No cinematic rush towards certainty. Just a pause. The kind of pause that doesn't feel dramatic until later, when everyone realizes that something irreversible has already happened, and the silence was the warning nobody recognized in time. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Here's the contradiction that sits at the center of this story, and it's one people tend to rush past. The moment that destroyed this family didn't arrive with violence. It arrived with a sentence. Quiet. Ordinary. Almost dismissible. I was never in the will. That's the line Nick Reiner says broke something open. Not the night. Not the arrest. Not the headlines that would follow. That sentence. And if you're already reacting, if you're thinking this sounds too small, too mundane to carry the weight of what happened next, that reaction is exactly why this story matters. Because the most devastating motives rarely announce themselves as motives at all. This case has been described in the usual ways. A wealthy family, a prestigious address, a brutal ending that seems, on the surface, inexplicable. The son lived on the property. The parents were found dead. The police moved quickly. The charges were filed. The public did what it always does. It assembled a narrative that felt neat enough to hold. But neat stories are comforting. They're also dangerous. What gets lost in the speed to understand is the slow accumulation. The years of conversations that didn't quite land. The glances that lingered too long. The assumptions that hardened into beliefs without ever being tested. Those things don't show up in police reports. They don't trend. And they rarely sound important until it's too late. So let's slow this down. Not to sensationalize it. Not to relitigate guilt or innocence in the abstract. But to understand the part of this story that doesn't sit comfortably inside the crime itself. Because Nick Reiner didn't begin his explanation with anger. He didn't begin with money. He began with exclusion. Or at least, the belief of it. The bodies were discovered on a Sunday. That detail keeps repeating in coverage, as if the day of the week carries some hidden symbolism. Maybe it does. Sundays have a way of amplifying stillness. Offices are closed. Calls go unanswered. The world moves a little slower, and when something breaks, it echoes. What's rarely lingered on is what the house was like before that discovery. Not the architecture, not the price tag, the atmosphere, the emotional weather. By most outward measures, this was not a family in crisis. There were no public feuds, no messy lawsuits, no estrangements played out in interviews or memoirs. The parents were visible, active, respected. The children appeared connected, orbiting close enough to suggest cohesion without raising suspicion. And Nick? He was there. Not gone. Not absent. Living just close enough to belong, and just far enough away to feel peripheral. The guest house is an easy detail to gloss over, but it matters. Living on the same property is not the same as living together. It's proximity without intimacy. Access without inclusion. You can hear doors closing without knowing what's being said behind them. If you've ever lived that kind of closeness, near enough to feel everything, distant enough to be left out, you understand how loud silence can become. Nick was 32, old enough that dependence doesn't explain his presence there, young enough that expectations still linger. He wasn't a child waiting for approval. He was an adult measuring his worth against cues that never came with subtitles. And here's where the story quietly turns. According to Nick, the will came up more than once. Not in formal settings. Not with lawyers present. In passing. In moments that felt casual enough to sting. I was never in it. That's what he says he was told. Not shown. Told. Think about that difference for a moment. Documents can be reviewed, clarified, corrected. Words spoken inside a family don't come with footnotes. They land where they land, shaped by tone, timing, and whatever emotional bruises already exist. If Nick believed, truly believed, that he had been written out, that he had never mattered enough to be included, then the will stopped being about assets. It became evidence, proof of something deeper, something personal. Was that belief accurate? That question sits at the center of everything, and yet it's not the one that defined Nick's actions in real time. Because belief doesn't wait for verification. It moves ahead, reshaping memory, reinterpreting every past interaction through a single, corrosive lens. Suddenly, jokes feel pointed. Advice feels patronizing. Silence feels deliberate. And here's the unsettling part. Families are uniquely positioned to create these distortions without intending to. A phrase said too quickly. A reassurance never offered. A clarification assumed unnecessary. Who corrects a misunderstanding when they don't know one exists? This is where the public narrative tends to flatten. The temptation is to declare the motive obvious. Money, greed, entitlement. Those words are easy to reach for because they fit inside familiar frameworks. But Nick's account resists that framing. He didn't say, "They left me nothing." He said, "I was never in it." That's not a claim about loss. It's a claim about identity, about erasure. And before we go any further, it's worth asking, quietly, honestly, how many families carry similar myths, unspoken but deeply felt? How many people walk around with a story about where they stand, based not on fact, but on implication? We don't know exactly when Nick stopped questioning the narrative he'd built. We do know that at some point, it calcified. What began as uncertainty hardened into certainty. And certainty, especially when it's rooted in perceived injustice, can be intoxicating. Because once you believe you've been wronged, everything else starts to align. The discovery of the bodies shattered whatever equilibrium existed. The call to police came from the daughter, Romy. That detail matters, too, not because it implicates her, but because it introduces a second internal perspective. She reportedly warned authorities about a dangerous family member. That phrase has been repeated without much exploration, as if its meaning is self-evident. It isn't. Was that fear newly formed? Or had it been quietly accumulating? Had she seen something others dismissed? Or was she responding to a sudden realization, reframing years of interaction in the harsh light of catastrophe? Those questions linger because families don't experience the same household in the same way. Each person carries a different version of the truth, shaped by proximity, temperament, and the roles they're assigned, explicitly or otherwise. Nick's role, by his own telling, was the one who didn't quite fit, the one whose place was ambiguous, not estranged, but not anchored. That ambiguity is fertile ground for resentment, especially when layered with comparison, with siblings, with expectations, with the quiet, corrosive question of why someone else seems to belong more naturally. And yet, even here, nothing feels inevitable. Plenty of people live with resentment without crossing a line. Plenty of misunderstandings get resolved. Plenty of hurts fade with time or clarity. So what changed? That's the question Nick's later admission forces us to confront. Not what he did, why he says he did it. Because if his account is taken at face value, the breaking point wasn't a fight. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a specific event. It was the accumulation of belief. Belief that he had been judged. Belief that the judgment was final. Belief that there was no appeal. And belief, once sealed, doesn't require ongoing evidence. It feeds on reinterpretation. It rewrites the past to justify the present. At some point, this is where Nick's timeline becomes murky. He stopped asking questions. Stopped seeking confirmation. Stopped leaving room for doubt. That's not unusual. Doubt is uncomfortable. Certainty, even painful certainty, offers a strange relief. But certainty built on assumption is fragile. And when it cracks, the break is rarely clean. There are parts of this story that remain deliberately vague, not because information doesn't exist, but because interpretation does the real damage here. Words said years earlier now carry the weight of prophecy. Silences are recast as strategy. Neutral acts become evidence of intent. And somewhere in that reinterpretation, the will stopped being a document and became a verdict. What's still unclear, what has not been fully reconciled, is whether Nick's understanding matched reality. Whether he was misled, whether he misunderstood, or whether something was said that should never have been left hanging without correction. Because if he was wrong, if the will never meant what he thought it meant, then the tragedy takes on a different shape altogether. It becomes a story not just of violence, but of failure, of communication, of assumption, of the quiet danger of leaving emotional landmines buried and unmarked. And that brings us to the most uncomfortable possibility of all. What if the most consequential lie in this story wasn't told by Nick? What if it wasn't a lie at all, but a sentence spoken carelessly, allowed to stand unchallenged, until it became something far more destructive than anyone intended? Because once Nick believed he had been erased, every interaction that followed was filtered through that belief. And once that filter was in place, the ending may have felt, not justified, but inevitable. But what came next would expose cracks in that belief. Cracks that suggest the truth was more complicated and far more dangerous. What if the night everyone thinks they understand isn't actually the night that matters? That question sits uncomfortably here, because the version of events that hardened fastest was the one that required the least patience. A wealthy home, a shocking discovery, a suspect already nearby, a timeline that looks clean enough if you don't press too hard on the edges. And most people didn't. They accepted the night as the beginning. But nights like that are almost never beginnings. They're endpoints. They're where long, quiet processes finally collide with reality. The mistake is assuming the collision explains the process. It doesn't. The night the bodies were found has been described in sharp, efficient terms. Sunday evening. A call placed. Officers arriving to a property that looked, from the outside, unchanged. No spectacle. No visible chaos spilling into the street. Just an address that would soon feel radioactive. Inside, the story fractures. What's striking is not what happened next, but how little happened at first. No immediate public statement. No neighbors describing screams or disturbances. No dramatic chase. The machinery of response moved forward, but without urgency bleeding into the margins. That calm unsettled people later. It still does. Because we're conditioned to expect violence to announce itself, to arrive with noise, with warning, with a visible rupture that tells us exactly where to look. This didn't, which raises a question that feels uncomfortable to ask, but impossible to ignore. If this wasn't an eruption, what was it? The house itself didn't tell a story. Not at first. There was no theatrical mess, no sign of a struggle that spilled from room to room. Whatever happened within a contained emotional geography. A space already familiar, already charged with history. And that matters. Because violence between strangers often looks different than violence within a family. Strangers collide. Families implode. Implosions don't announce themselves outwardly. They collapse inward, drawing everything tight, compressing years into moments. When police began their work, they weren't just stepping into a crime scene. They were stepping into a family's unresolved interior life. Every object, every room, every shared space carried residue. Not forensic residue. Emotional residue. Those things don't show up in evidence photos. But they influence everything. Nick was on the property. That fact became the spine of the narrative almost immediately. The guest house detail returned again and again in coverage, as if proximity alone could do the explanatory work. He lived there. Therefore. But therefore what? Living near someone doesn't tell you how they relate to each other. It doesn't tell you what's been said, what's been withheld, what's been allowed to fester. Proximity can amplify connection or deepen alienation, sometimes both at once. Nick's presence was interpreted as opportunity. Motive was inferred from access. And access is easy to misunderstand when you don't know the emotional map of a household. Was he welcome? Was he tolerated? Was he invisible? Those questions weren't asked early. They didn't need to be, not for the narrative that was forming. A simpler version was already taking shape, and simplicity has gravity. Once it starts pulling, nuance struggles to escape. The daughter's call to police added another layer, one that should have slowed the story down, but instead sharpened it. She reportedly mentioned a dangerous family member. That phrase landed hard. It suggested foreknowledge, awareness, fear that predated the discovery. But dangerous is a slippery word. It can mean volatile. It can mean unstable. It can mean unpredictable. Or it can mean someone who has crossed an invisible line in the imagination long before they cross any physical one. Which did she mean? That question matters because it reframes how we understand the family dynamic leading up to the night. If concern existed earlier, what form did it take? Conversations? Warnings? Or just a feeling no one knew how to articulate? Families are notoriously bad at naming danger when it wears a familiar face. We excuse. We normalize. We adjust. Until adjustment becomes avoidance. And avoidance, over time, creates its own risk. By the time the authorities arrived, the story was already being assembled. Not deliberately, not maliciously, but inevitably. Humans seek coherence in chaos. We grab the pieces that seem to fit and start building. The danger is assuming the first structure is the right one. Nick was arrested that night. Charges followed quickly. first-degree murder. Language heavy with finality. Words that suggest clarity, even when clarity is still emerging. From the outside, it looked decisive. From the inside, it was anything but. Because what hadn't yet been examined, what wouldn't be examined for some time, was the psychological timeline. The slow drift towards certainty. The internal conversations Nick had with himself long before anyone else noticed something was wrong. Those don't leave fingerprints. What they leave instead are subtle shifts. Withdrawal, irritation, fixation. A narrowing of perspective that can be invisible to others, especially in families where emotional self-sufficiency is mistaken for health. If Nick felt excluded, truly excluded, it likely didn't arrive as a dramatic revelation. It arrived incrementally. A comment here, a silence there, a decision made without consultation, a reassurance never offered because no one realized it was needed. People underestimate how powerful those accumulations can be, especially when they converge around identity. The will, in this story, becomes less important as a legal instrument than as a symbol. It represents recognition, belonging, a tangible acknowledgement of place. And when someone believes they've been denied that acknowledgement, it doesn't stay confined to estate planning. It bleeds outward, coloring every interaction. Was this conversation misunderstood? Possibly. Was it oversimplified? Likely. Was it clarified? Apparently not. That absence of clarification looms large. Because misunderstandings don't require malice to become dangerous. They require neglect. They require assumptions left unchallenged because confrontation feels uncomfortable or unnecessary. Nick's belief that he was never included became a fixed point. And once it fixed, it reorganized his internal narrative. Past moments were reinterpreted. Neutral interactions acquired edge. Affection felt conditional. Advice felt dismissive. And once a person begins reading meaning into absence, absence becomes confirmation. It's important to say this carefully. Understanding this psychological progression does not excuse what followed. It doesn't justify violence. It doesn't mitigate harm. But it does explain why the night itself tells us so little. Because by the time that night arrived, the story had already been written in Nick's mind. The action was just the final punctuation. That's what makes the popular focus on the discovery feel incomplete. As if we're staring at the period at the end of a sentence and ignoring everything that came before it. There's another detail that rarely gets lingered on. The lack of public conflict prior to this. No explosive arguments reported. No documented threats. No escalating confrontations that would signal imminent danger. That absence confuses people. It makes the act seem sudden, random. But implosions don't require public warning signs. They require internal certainty. And certainty, when isolated, can become absolute. Nick didn't frame his later explanation around rage. He framed it around realization. Around a moment when something clicked into place and refused to move again. That framing unsettles people because it doesn't match our expectations of how violence is supposed to sound. We want anger. We want passion. We want something loud enough to warn us. What we get instead is something quieter, more deliberate, more chilling. The early hours after the discovery were filled with procedural motion. Statements, processing, logistics, the machinery of response doing what it's designed to do. What they weren't filled with was introspection. That came later. Much later, only after the initial shock faded did questions begin to surface. Questions that didn't fit neatly inside the early narrative. Why had the will conversation mattered so much? Why had it gone unexamined for so long? Why did different family members seem to carry such different understandings of the same household? And perhaps most unsettling of all, if Nick's belief was wrong, if the will never excluded him in the way he thought, how did that misunderstanding survive uncorrected? Because misunderstandings of that magnitude don't persist in isolation. They persist because no one challenges them, or because challenges are too subtle to register, or because the person holding the belief is no longer receptive to contradiction. At some point, Nick stopped seeking reassurance, stopped asking for clarity. That shift is crucial. It marks the moment when dialogue gives way to monologue. And once someone is alone in their certainty, the world becomes an echo chamber. The night everyone focuses on is the night that certainty finally acted. But certainty itself had been building quietly, patiently, for a long time. Which brings us to the part of the story that unsettles investigators and observers alike. Because when the initial paperwork was reviewed, when documents were examined without the emotional charge of belief, things didn't align as cleanly as expected. The will, it turns out, was not as simple as in or out. The language was more nuanced, the timelines more complex, the assumptions less secure, and that discrepancy between belief and documentation opens a door that's hard to close once you step through it. If Nick was me, carried around like a verdict, not never, not absolute erasure. Instead, what emerges is something messier, conditional language, timing issues, provisions that depended on age, milestones, future decisions. The kind of legal scaffolding that makes sense to attorneys and feels opaque, even threatening, to anyone who hears it secondhand. And that's the point. Because no one experiences a will as a legal instrument inside a family. They experience it as a message. You matter. You don't. You're trusted. You're not. Those messages don't require accuracy to take hold. They require credibility. So let's ask the obvious, uncomfortable question again. Who framed the will for Nick? Was it a parent, speaking casually, assuming reassurance wasn't necessary? Was it a sibling, interpreting something half-heard? Was it Nick himself, filling in gaps left by silence? Or was it someone else entirely? Someone with enough proximity to sound informed, enough authority to be believed, and enough distance to avoid follow-up? Because here's what stands out once you slow down. Nick didn't describe discovering the will. He described being told about it. That distinction is everything. Being told removes agency. It positions the speaker as gatekeeper, the listener as recipient. And if the listener already feels peripheral, that imbalance deepens. At some point, this is where the timeline blurs. Nick stopped asking to see the documents. Stopped pressing for clarification. That doesn't happen when someone is confident in their place. It happens when someone believes the answer is already settled. And belief, once settled, resists interference. Investigators would later note that Nick's certainty didn't fluctuate, not even when confronted with inconsistencies. He didn't hedge. He didn't soften. He returned to the same phrasing, the same framing, as if repeating it might stabilize something inside him. I was never in it. Not, I was removed. Not, I was treated unfairly. Never. That word suggests finality. It suggests origin. It suggests that from the very beginning, his place had been illusory. And if that's how he saw it, then everything else begins to align around that belief. Living in the guest house stops being transitional and starts being symbolic. A physical manifestation of emotional distance. Close enough to serve, not close enough to belong. Family conversations become performances. Warmth feels conditional. Praise feels strategic. Even silence takes on shape. What's striking is how long this interpretation seems to have gone unchallenged. That doesn't mean others shared it. It means they didn't know it existed, or didn't recognize it as dangerous. Families are particularly bad at spotting this kind of internal drift. We assume proximity equals understanding. We assume shared history prevents misinterpretation. It doesn't. In fact, shared history can make misinterpretation easier. We fill in gaps based on old roles. The difficult child, the sensitive one, the independent one, labels that calcify early and shape how concerns are received. If Nick raised doubts, were they dismissed as insecurity? If he expressed frustration, was it attributed to immaturity? If he withdrew, was it seen as self-sufficiency? Those interpretations matter because they determine whether someone intervenes or assumes things will work themselves out. There's another layer here that complicates everything: timing. The will revisions didn't happen in a vacuum. They corresponded with changes in the family's life. Health considerations, financial planning, standard adjustments that happen quietly, methodically. But timing, when filtered through resentment, becomes motive. A change that coincides with a disagreement becomes punishment. A delay becomes rejection. A condition becomes exclusion. Nick appears to have mapped emotional meaning onto legal mechanics. That's not unusual. It's human. But it's also dangerous when no one steps in to correct the map. The daughter's reported concern begins to look different through this lens. Not as a sudden realization, but as an accumulation of unease. A sense that something wasn't aligning. That Nick's internal narrative was tightening rather than loosening. Danger doesn't always look like threats. Sometimes it looks like fixation. And fixation, Once it locks onto an idea, especially an idea tied to worth, can become immovable. By the time the documents were examined closely, it was already too late for clarification to matter. The belief had done its work. But here's where the story refuses to settle. Because when investigators traced who had access to the will, who discussed it, who might have framed it informally, patterns emerged that didn't point cleanly in one direction. Different family members recalled different conversations, different emphases, different tones. No single moment where the sentence, "you were never included," was definitively spoken in that exact form. Which raises a disturbing possibility. What if no one ever said it that way? What if the sentence Nick carried wasn't quoted, but constructed? Constructed from fragments, from half-statements, from implications never meant to be definitive. That kind of construction doesn't require deception. It requires ambiguity and a listener already primed to hear exclusion. If that's the case, then the tragedy sits not in a lie, but in a vacuum, a space where clarification should have lived and didn't. And once that vacuum filled with certainty, the family lost its ability to intervene. There's a moment investigators return to repeatedly, though it didn't seem important at first. A conversation, casual, unremarkable at the time, where the will was mentioned and quickly dismissed. We'll talk about it later. Later never came. Later rarely does. Those 3 words can be devastating when someone is already questioning their place. They sound like deferral, like avoidance, like confirmation that the topic itself is unwelcome. Nick's fixation didn't erupt after that moment. It crystallized, and crystallization is quiet. No shouting, no confrontation, just a narrowing, a withdrawal into interpretation, a shift from asking, "Is this true?" to declaring, "This is what it means." Once that shift occurs, facts struggle to penetrate. By the time the night arrived, the night everyone thinks they understand, the story was already sealed inside him. The action was not impulsive. It was consistent with a narrative he had been rehearsing internally for years. That's what makes the discrepancy between belief and documentation so haunting. It suggests a tragedy built not on greed, but on a misunderstanding allowed to harden into identity. And yet, there's still one question that won't go away. If the documents didn't support his belief, why was no one able to dislodge it? Why didn't a single conversation intervene in time? Because someone, somewhere, reinforced it. Even passively, even unintentionally. Silence can be reinforcement. Deflection can be reinforcement. Assuming someone will get over it can be reinforcement. And that brings us to the part of the story that investigators struggled with most. Not what Nick believed, but who benefited from letting him believe it. Because once you ask that question, the narrative shifts again. Away from the obvious, away from the easy explanations, towards something far more unsettling. Who benefits? It's an ugly question. Not because it implies conspiracy, but because it forces us to stop treating this as a closed system. One person, one belief, one outcome. Beliefs don't form in isolation. They're shaped, reinforced, allowed to echo. And echoes don't require a speaker every time. By the time investigators began asking that question, quietly, almost reluctantly, the case had already taken on a familiar shape in the public imagination. Son, parents, proximity, motive presumed. End of story. But inside the investigation, that shape started to warp. Because once you accept that the will may not have meant what Nick believed it meant, you're left with an uncomfortable gap. A gap that doesn't explain itself. Someone had to occupy it. Or something did. Let's be careful here. This isn't about pointing fingers where evidence doesn't exist. It's about examining dynamics that often get overlooked because they don't fit the clean lines of criminal narratives. Families are ecosystems. Information moves unevenly. Authority isn't always formal. Influence doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it sounds like reassurance. Sometimes like dismissal. Sometimes like silence. Investigators noticed early on that Nick's belief wasn't reactive. It wasn't something he discovered suddenly and spiraled over. It had been with him for a while. Long enough to become part of how he interpreted everything else. Which means it had to be sustained. Think about that for a moment. Sustained beliefs require maintenance. Even false ones. Especially false ones. If someone challenges them, they either adapt or harden. Nick's didn't adapt. They hardened. That suggests he wasn't being challenged in any meaningful way. or that challenges came in forms he couldn't hear. Who might have been in a position to intervene? Parents, certainly. But parents often underestimate how much their offhand comments land, especially with adult children, especially when they assume their love is obvious enough not to require reinforcement. Siblings, maybe, but siblings don't always share emotional information cleanly. They filter, they protect, they compete, they assume someone else will step in. Extended family? Friends? Advisors? Here's where the story becomes more complex and less comfortable. Because as investigators traced the social orbit around the family, they noticed something subtle. Nick wasn't isolated in the way people assume isolation looks. He wasn't cut off. He wasn't alone. He had conversations. He had people who listened. But listening isn't the same as correcting. In fact, listening without correction can feel like validation. If Nick expressed his belief, if he said, even casually, "I was never in the will," and no one challenged that framing, what did that silence communicate? At minimum, acceptance. At worst, agreement. No one has come forward to say they actively reinforced the idea. No text messages surfaced saying, "You were excluded." No recorded conversations spelling it out. But that's not how reinforcement usually works. It works through nods. Through, "That must be hard." Through, "I can see why you'd feel that way." Through letting a statement pass without question. And once a belief feels socially confirmed, it gains legitimacy. Nick's certainty began to look less like paranoia and more like consensus, at least within the small circle he trusted enough to talk to. That's a dangerous threshold, because once someone believes others see the injustice too, self-doubt evaporates. The internal debate ends. The narrative locks. Investigators also noted that Nick's language around the will became more rigid over time. Early references were vague, emotional. Later ones were definitive, absolute. That progression matters. It suggests rehearsal, repetition, a story told often enough to lose its rough edges. Stories smooth themselves out the more we tell them. Contradictions get edited. Uncertainty drops away. By the end, all that remains is the version that feels right. And the more that version is repeated without challenge, the more it feels unassailable. There's another angle here that complicates the idea of benefit. Not everyone who benefits from a belief intends harm. Sometimes the benefit is avoidance. Avoiding conflict. Avoiding uncomfortable conversations. Avoiding the emotional labor of correcting someone who seems fragile, defensive, or volatile. If someone around Nick sensed his fixation but chose not to engage it, chose to let it be, hoping it would dissipate, that choice had consequences. Because beliefs don't dissipate in silence. They ferment. The daughter's concern, when viewed through this lens, feels less sudden, less reactive. It begins to look like recognition. A late-stage realization that something had gone unaddressed for too long. Calling someone dangerous doesn't always mean physically threatening. It can mean psychologically unstable, unmoored, locked into a narrative that no longer responds to reality. That kind of danger is hard to name, especially inside families that prize composure and self-control. And when danger is hard to name, it's easy to postpone action. There's also the uncomfortable possibility that no one benefited at all, that this wasn't about gain, but about neglect. Neglect isn't dramatic. It doesn't leave evidence. It's the absence of intervention, the decision to let things ride because confronting them feels worse in the moment. But neglect accumulates. And in families with resources, neglect can hide behind normalcy, behind routines that look functional, behind assumptions that someone wouldn't really do anything. Investigators found no evidence of financial desperation, no sudden monetary trigger, no debt, no impending loss that would force immediate action. Which brings us back to identity. If this wasn't about money, then it was about meaning, about being seen, about having one's place affirmed in a way that felt unambiguous. And when affirmation doesn't come, people look for explanation. Nick's explanation, being excluded from the will, offered clarity. It explained the guest house, the distance, the emotional ambiguity. It gave shape to diffuse pain. And once pain has a shape, it becomes easier to act on. Here's the part that unsettles even seasoned investigators. No one intervened decisively. Not with facts, not with documentation, not with a conversation that began. That's not actually what this says. Why? Possibly because no one realized how literal Nick's interpretation had become. Possibly because they assumed he understood the difference between legal nuance and emotional reality. Possibly because they underestimated how much the belief mattered. We often assume that adult family members are resilient enough to absorb ambiguity, that they can tolerate uncertainty without breaking. That assumption can be fatal, because ambiguity, when paired with insecurity, doesn't remain neutral. It tips. It resolves itself into certainty, one way or another. By the time the documents were scrutinized, the opportunity for correction had passed. Even if someone had sat Nick down and walked him through every clause, every condition, every revision, it likely wouldn't have mattered. The belief had already been integrated into his identity, and identities defend themselves fiercely. Which brings us to the most disturbing realization of all. This tragedy may not have required a villain beyond the act itself. It may have required only a series of non-actions. A chain of moments where intervention felt unnecessary, uncomfortable, or premature. A belief allowed to grow. A silence allowed to persist. A sentence allowed to stand. And once that belief solidified, it created its own logic. A logic that made the unthinkable feel coherent. That's why the question of benefit lingers without resolution. Because the benefit may have been collective avoidance. A family's shared reluctance to name something painful until it named them instead. As investigators continued to pull at this thread, another realization emerged, one that shifted the focus yet again. Because even if the belief was wrong, even if it was constructed from fragments and silence, it still shaped Nick's actions. Which raises a final, chilling question for this chapter. If belief alone can drive behavior with this much force, how many other assumptions inside families go unchallenged, waiting for consequences no one imagines? And more importantly, what did Nick say when he finally admitted the reason out loud? Because when he did, it reframed everything that came before and pointed toward a truth far more unsettling than anyone expected. What did he say when he finally stopped circling the reason and named it? Not the version that fits in a charging document. Not the one that sounds legible to strangers. The one that made sense to him when there was no one left to convince. According to those who later heard it, filtered, careful, secondhand, it didn't come out as a confession in the way people expect. There was no dramatic unveiling, no sudden emotional collapse. It arrived the same way the belief had formed, quietly, deliberately, almost as if he were explaining something obvious that everyone else had missed. It wasn't about money. That line alone unsettled people, because money is the motive everyone knows how to process. It's transactional. It's ugly but familiar. You can diagram it. You can condemn it cleanly. This was different. Nick didn't talk about inheritance as a loss of assets. He talked about it as a verdict, a declaration of worth, or the lack of it. What he described, again, in his own framing, wasn't greed. It was erasure. And here's where the story becomes harder to sit with, because erasure doesn't sound like motive. It sounds abstract, psychological, the kind of thing people dismiss until it's too late. But erasure, when internalized, can feel existential. Nick's explanation didn't begin with anger. It began with recognition, with a moment when he says something clicked and refused to unclick. He believed he had finally understood his role, not the role he hoped for, the one he'd been playing all along. Peripheral, conditional, temporary. And once that realization settled in, he stopped waiting for confirmation, stopped seeking reassurance, stopped imagining alternate explanations. The story, in his mind, was complete. Investigators would later note something strange about how Nick spoke during this phase. He wasn't erratic. He wasn't incoherent. He didn't jump between theories. He returned, again and again, to the same conceptual anchor. I never mattered. That sentence didn't appear in reports because it's not legally useful, but it's psychologically revealing. Because when someone believes they never mattered, the future collapses. Planning becomes pointless. Repair feels impossible. Dialogue loses relevance. If you believe your role was always provisional, then nothing is truly at stake anymore. This is where the distinction between motive and justification becomes important. Nick didn't describe his reasoning as justification. He described it as inevitability, as if events had simply caught up to what had already been decided long ago. That framing is chilling because it removes agency. It positions the act not as a choice, but as a consequence. And once someone frames their actions that way, moral boundaries begin to blur. Investigators struggled with this part of the case because it didn't fit standard psychological profiles. There was no sudden break, no psychotic episode, no obvious trigger in the immediate lead-up. Instead, there was consolidation. The belief that had been forming quietly finally solidified into identity. Nick wasn't reacting to a single slight. He was acting in accordance with a story he believed had been true all along. That doesn't make it rational. It makes it coherent to him. And coherence is dangerous. There's a moment described by someone who interacted with Nick not long before everything unraveled. It's not dramatic. That's what makes it unsettling. He seemed resolved. Not angry. Not frantic. Just settled. Resolution is often mistaken for peace. But it can also signal finality. People assume violence comes from chaos. Sometimes it comes from clarity. The clarity Nick believed he'd achieved left no room for negotiation. No room for repair. No room for misunderstanding. Because to Nick, the details were everything. What emerges isn't a single moment of deception, but a pattern of deferral, of leaving difficult conversations for later, of assuming that time would smooth over discomfort. Time doesn't smooth belief. It deepens it. One investigator put it bluntly, off the record. This didn't feel like a case where someone lied. It felt like a case where no one corrected. Correction is an act of care. It requires stepping into discomfort. It risks conflict. It means acknowledging that someone else's interpretation has gone somewhere dangerous. It's easier not to do it, especially in families that prize independence, especially with adult children who are assumed to be resilient, especially when the topic, money, inheritance, legacy, feels impolite to dwell on. So the belief sat there. And as it sat, it reorganized Nick's internal world. He began to interpret kindness as obligation, distance as strategy, silence as confirmation. That's the thing about uncorrected beliefs. They don't just exist. They work. They actively reshape perception. Investigators noticed that once Nick began speaking about the will in absolute terms, his other narratives tightened as well. Stories about childhood, about approval, about being seen. They became simpler, more linear, less nuanced. That simplification is a warning sign. Life is rarely linear. When someone starts telling a story that has no contradictions, no unresolved edges, it's often because uncertainty has become intolerable. Nick's story eliminated uncertainty entirely. And once uncertainty is gone, doubt has nowhere to land. There's a moment that keeps resurfacing in interviews and statements, though it seemed inconsequential at the time. A family discussion where the topic of future planning came up. Not heated, not dramatic, just mentioned. Nick reportedly asked a question. Not accusatory, not emotional. A question that could have opened the door. The response was deflective, not dismissive, but brief. We'll get to that. It's handled. Don't worry. Those phrases are meant to soothe. They often do. But they also close conversations. And when someone already feels peripheral, closure can sound like exclusion. Investigators would later reconstruct how that moment was internalized, not as reassurance, but as confirmation that the topic itself was off limits. Nick didn't push. That's important. He didn't escalate. He withdrew. Withdrawal is often mistaken for acceptance. It isn't. It's the beginning of internal resolution. Once someone stops asking questions, it's not because they've found peace. It's because they believe they already have the answer. At that point, correction requires intervention. Active, explicit, sometimes uncomfortable intervention. That never happened. The belief, unchallenged, became explanatory. It explained why he lived where he lived, why conversations felt strained, why warmth felt conditional. It even explained why no one was correcting him. They don't want to talk about it because it's true. That's the kind of logic that forms when silence is misread. And here's where the story becomes even harder to accept, because it suggests something deeply counterintuitive. The people closest to Nick may have believed they were avoiding harm by not engaging, by not making a big deal out of what they saw as insecurity or misinterpretation. They may have believed that pressing the issue would only inflame it. In some cases, that's true. In this case, it wasn't. Avoidance didn't defuse the belief. It protected it. By the time anyone realized how entrenched it had become, it was no longer a belief that could be reasoned with. It had become identity. And identity doesn't respond to correction the way opinions do. This is where the idea of benefit returns, not as motive, but as consequence. Who benefited from the silence? No one intentionally, but silence benefited the belief. It allowed it to mature uninterrupted. And that maturation had a cost. When Nick finally articulated his reason, when he stopped circling it and named it, he wasn't presenting it as a grievance. He was presenting it as a fact of his existence. I was never in it. Not an accusation. A conclusion. Conclusions are hard to undo. Investigators tried, at that point, to understand whether Nick had ever been presented with the documents directly, whether he'd ever been shown the clauses that contradicted his belief. The answer was unclear. He may have seen parts. He may have heard summaries. He may have been told just enough to feel informed without feeling included. That in-between state is lethal, because partial information invites narrative completion, and the completion is guided by emotion. Nick completed the narrative with exclusion, and once completed, the narrative justified everything that followed. This is where people want a moment of revelation, a smoking gun, a single conversation where everything could have turned out differently. There isn't one. There's only accumulation. Accumulation of silence. Accumulation of deflection. Accumulation of assumptions, each small enough to ignore. Together, overwhelming. When investigators laid out the sequence, not as a timeline of events, but as a timeline of missed interventions, it became clear that the tragedy wasn't born of a single failure. It was born of many ordinary ones. And that's what makes it so unsettling. Because ordinary failures are everywhere. They happen in families that function, in homes that appear stable, in relationships that look loving from the outside. They happen when we assume understanding instead of confirming it. They happen when we avoid discomfort in the name of peace. They happen when we underestimate how much a single sentence can weigh on someone already questioning their place. Nick's belief didn't require validation from a crowd. It required only the absence of correction from those who mattered. Once that absence stretched long enough, it became proof. And proof, in his mind, demanded action. That doesn't make the action understandable in a moral sense. It makes it intelligible in a psychological one, which is far more disturbing. Because it suggests that the line between normal family dynamics and catastrophe is thinner than we want to believe. As the investigation moved forward, this realization shifted the tone. It stopped being about reconstructing a crime and started being about dissecting a failure of communication. A failure that no one intended. A failure that no one noticed in time. And that raises the most uncomfortable question of all. If no one meant for this to happen, if no one lied, no one schemed, no one planned, then how many other families are sitting on similar misunderstandings, believing time will take care of them? Because time doesn't take care of belief. It feeds it. And the final, devastating irony here is this. Once Nick acted on the belief, the truth no longer mattered. Correction came too late. But what investigators uncovered next, when they examined how Nick spoke about responsibility afterward, revealed something even more chilling. Because when asked whether anyone could have changed his mind, his answer suggested that by the end, there was no mind left to change. And that's where this story turns again. The statement hung in the air. By the time anyone could intervene, there was no mind left to change. That's the kind of sentence that makes investigators pause, not because it's dramatic, but because it's precise. It describes a psychological fact that is almost impossible to reverse once it sets in. Belief had become identity, and identity had reached a point of immovability. At this stage, what Nick described wasn't anger. It wasn't frustration. It wasn't even resentment in the way the public imagines it. It was a settled logic, a conclusion drawn from years of perception filtered through silence, partial information, and misunderstanding. The will, once a series of clauses and contingencies, had been translated into a verdict. He had been peripheral. He had been erased. He had never mattered in the ways that counted. What's unnerving is how ordinary this process looks when you trace it backward. Nothing leaps out as abnormal in retrospect. No one can pinpoint a singular dramatic event that triggered the collapse. The triggers were small: a passing remark, a deferral, a shrug, a delay, a glance, a silence. Each individually unremarkable, collectively lethal. Investigators noticed the way these small events accumulate. In many families, trivial misunderstandings get corrected over time. Conversations happen. Clarifications appear. But in this case, nothing of the sort occurred. The misperception never met a counterforce strong enough to disrupt its growth. Silence, in this context, was active. It allowed the belief to ferment, to evolve, to gain momentum. It became a self-reinforcing narrative. And what's striking is Nick's internalization of it. He describes a moment of clarity where he believed everything about his standing in the family had finally been revealed to him in its starkest terms. Not an emotional outburst, not a confrontation, just an acceptance. He now understood his place, or the lack of it. And understanding, he felt, demanded action. That's what makes this kind of tragedy different from ordinary crime narratives. There is no external villain. The act is horrifying, yes, but the real danger arises from the quiet, slow accumulation of belief, misbelief, that no one interrupts. From misunderstanding that hardens into certainty. From a narrative that becomes impermeable to correction. Investigators also traced interactions with other family members during this period. There were attempts, gentle ones, to engage Nick in conversations about his role, about the will, about expectations. But these were filtered through politeness, through deference, through assumptions that he understood the context better than he did. Every attempt at clarification was deflected or reinterpreted as affirmation, further embedding the belief. The reinforcement was accidental, but effective. As the timeline progressed, the narrative inside Nick's mind became increasingly linear, increasingly coherent, and increasingly closed. Everything aligned around the central tenet. He had been excluded, erased, peripheral. Every minor slight, every delay, every unspoken word was evidence. Every act of avoidance by others confirmed his theory. Even affection or acknowledgement could be reinterpreted as conditional, transactional, or hollow. Here is the chilling detail. By the time the act occurred, this wasn't a story of immediate provocation. It wasn't an explosive, reactive moment. It was a culmination. Years of miscommunication, misunderstanding, passive reinforcement, and internalization had created a framework in which the action made sense to him. That framework did not require moral justification. It only required perceived coherence. And coherence had been achieved. There's a paradox here. To outside observers, it may seem irrational, even absurd. Why act violently over a misunderstanding? Over a belief that may not correspond to reality? The answer lies in the psychological process. Beliefs that structure identity are not optional. When your self-concept depends on the narrative, action consistent with that narrative feels inevitable. In other words, the world behaves as the internal narrative dictates, and the narrative, once fully crystallized, becomes resistant to contradiction. Facts, evidence, and reality itself cannot penetrate. Investigators also noted that Nick's articulation of his reasoning, after the act, was strikingly matter-of-fact. There was no flourish, no melodrama, no attempt to dramatize. He spoke in calm, controlled language about how he had reached a point where action was unavoidable, not because he was compelled by external pressure, but because the narrative he had carried inside himself for years dictated it. This is what makes the story so unsettling. Normalcy and horror coexist in the same mind, seamlessly. Another layer emerges when considering the daughter's role. Romy reportedly called authorities, highlighting a dangerous family member. That statement, often repeated in early reporting, has been simplified in public discourse to mean foreknowledge or suspicion of impending violence. But its significance is more nuanced. It reflects the recognition that Nick's fixation and the internalization of his belief had reached a level that could no longer be managed informally. The danger was not sudden. It had been building, quietly, within the household, and Romy was the first to interpret the signals accurately. Unfortunately, it may have been too late. When reconstructing the psychological timeline, investigators began to appreciate how the intersection of belief, isolation, and lack of intervention formed a critical threshold. In families, disagreements and misunderstandings typically resolve over time through conversation, intervention, or social pressure. In this case, every opportunity for such resolution was missed or misapplied. Statements that could have corrected the narrative were deflected, clarifications were withheld or delayed, minor acts of acknowledgement were misinterpreted or ignored. The cumulative effect was the formation of an impermeable internal narrative that ultimately justified catastrophic action. And yet, even at this point, one question dominates. Could the trajectory have been altered? If someone had intervened earlier, had challenged the belief explicitly, had provided access to the full documentation of the will, could Nick have reevaluated? The answer is uncertain, and therein lies the disturbing lesson. The system failed, not through malice, but through ordinary human assumptions, that adult children understand more than they do, that polite avoidance is protective, that partial truth is harmless. By the time the will itself was examined carefully, line by line, clause by clause, the realization crystallized. The belief was fundamentally misaligned with reality. The legal documents did not exclude him. They hedged, deferred, and anticipated change. But the misperception had already achieved dominance. By the time clarity arrived, it was external, irrelevant to the internal logic Nick had adopted over years. And that is what makes the night of the tragedy simultaneously predictable and incomprehensible. From the outside, it appears sudden. From the inside, it is the inevitable endpoint of a long, quiet internal evolution. A story not written in dramatic confrontations or overt signals, but in absence, deferral, silence, and the slow crystallization of belief. Finally, investigators noted that Nick, when discussing the event afterward, framed his action as necessary, not retaliatory, not reactive, but coherent within the narrative he had built. The language used was neutral, deliberate, and clinical. It demonstrates that the most dangerous processes are not always visible, not always noisy, not always externally chaotic. Sometimes, the most catastrophic outcomes emerge from years of unnoticed internal reinforcement and unchallenged interpretation. And yet, there remains one final twist that keeps investigators and observers alike unsettled. Because when you consider the discrepancy between belief and reality and the absence of effective intervention, the real question becomes: if so much was preventable, if so much could have been corrected, then who, or what, allowed this belief to fester until it became uncontainable? The answer is neither simple nor comforting. It's a combination of circumstance, human error, and the quiet accumulation of assumptions. Ordinary factors, seemingly insignificant on their own, collided over time to create an extraordinary outcome. And in that convergence lies the true horror. That catastrophe can grow quietly in plain sight, shielded by silence, reinforced by neglect, and finalized by internalized certainty. The next piece of the story lies in that convergence, where belief, silence, and inaction collide. It's a point where ordinary human tendencies intersect with extraordinary consequences. And it's also where the narrative begins to shift from what happened to why it could happen, not in flashes, but in the slow accumulation of unchallenged perception. Investigators began examining the pattern of interactions within the household, looking for the subtle cues and small moments that might have predicted escalation. These were not dramatic events. There were no public arguments, no shouting matches, no obvious outbursts. What they found instead were minor deferrals, repeated assumptions, and an almost imperceptible series of omissions. Every casual dismissal, every "we'll talk about it later," every unexamined comment about the will contributed to the internalization of belief. One example stands out. In casual conversation, someone reportedly mentioned a clause that affected Nick's potential inheritance. The tone was neutral, almost dismissive, and the discussion moved on quickly. On the surface, nothing happened. On the inside, that sentence anchored a pre-existing perception. He was peripheral. He was overlooked. He was never truly part of the narrative. It was a minor point that became monumental, precisely because no one addressed it in a way that Nick could process accurately. That's the insidious nature of internalized belief. It doesn't require malice. It only requires neglect or the absence of counter-narrative. And once the belief crystallizes, facts, logic, and explanation lose efficacy. They cannot penetrate the framework the mind has constructed. Investigators also noted a pattern in Nick's interactions with his sister, Romy. Early in the family timeline, she had occasionally attempted clarification, gently suggesting that the documents might be misinterpreted or that certain provisions were conditional. These interventions were subtle and indirect. They were framed as reassurance rather than correction. To an outsider, they might seem sufficient. To someone whose identity had become tied to exclusion, they were insufficient. They were reframed as evidence of patronization or as further proof of distance. In effect, the interventions reinforced rather than mitigated the belief. And this points to a crucial detail. Perception is often more powerful than reality. Once a narrative has been internalized, the individual interprets every interaction through its lens. Neutral gestures are read as confirmation. Reassurances are discounted. Silence becomes meaningful. Every action, every inaction, every nuance is assimilated into a framework that demands consistency with the pre-existing belief. That framework is what ultimately guided the catastrophic action. It's why the act did not appear impulsive. It's why, despite the absence of overt provocation, the trajectory was coherent, at least internally. And it's also why attempts at post-event analysis often struggle to reconcile external facts with internal logic. From the outside, the story looks irrational. From within, it is logical, unavoidable, the endpoint of a carefully rehearsed internal narrative. Investigators also traced the broader pattern of communication within the family network. It revealed a kind of echo chamber effect. Partial truths and ambiguous statements circulated repeatedly, reinforcing the perception of exclusion. Even statements intended to clarify were sometimes misinterpreted or reframed to fit the internal logic Nick had established. The result was cumulative reinforcement. Each minor interaction, every casual comment, each piece of ambiguity strengthened the narrative rather than weakening it. What becomes clear at this stage is that catastrophe did not emerge from a single moment of intent.